Welcome back to my coverage on the Zurich International Chess Tournament of 1953. Today we have two games in round 6 that we're going to go into. The first one is this one right here, Bronstein against Euwe, and this one, it included everything. There was a queen sacrifice, there was a king who was dragged up the board to the 6th or 5th rank, there was an incredible aggressive attack. It is truly a beautiful game to watch. And the second game that we're going to look at is this one right here, where I don't really care much about the opening or middle game of this game, but I'm actually just going to dive into a very specific moment in the end game, which I thought was incredibly instructive and I thought would be helpful to share. If you guys have missed some of the previous editions of this series, then you can check them in the description down below. And with that, let's dive into the 6th round. Alright, so here's the first game. It is, as I said, Bronstein against Euwe. Bronstein has the white pieces, and this was an incredibly aggressive game from white. And you will see exactly what I'm talking about in a second. The opening was actually rather calm. White got great space in the center, but this is a known theoretical position for black, and black strikes in the center with this move e5 that you see. Now queen to c2, getting off of the d file and ready to put one of the rooks perhaps on the d file. Now we had rook to e8, and in previous games and in future games after this game was played, in this line, black sometimes went for queen to e7, and it's just interesting to note that after queen to e7, white can take the pawn and force the queen to move again, and now the queen kind of just wasted time. And so what black went for here is a way to save time, because after taking on the pawn on e5, now the difference is the queen can move, but black got an extra move, right? The rook used to be here, now it's here, and so black would have saved some time. So this is the idea. And therefore, after this move, instead of taking and allowing this idea to be accomplished, white played the move e4 and striked in the center. e4 is the typical idea that white has here. It allows this bishop to get more active along this diagonal, and also it allows white to open up the position in a way that typically is advantageous for them, because you can imagine if these files open up, white has incredible access once this bishop develops to put the rooks here, and white will have very good control on the center files. So now e takes on d4 happened. You might be wondering, what about c4 here? And c4 was actually a very interesting idea that would have allowed black in this line, you can see, to actually trade off the queens and then win back the pawn. But black decided to keep the queens on and go for a more crazy game and take in the center and allow for more combinations and perhaps a longer middle game and more interesting game to occur. Bishop to g4 was played here. Now c takes on d4. This is not a free pawn, of course. You can simply take on d4 here. The knight is pinned. You can also throw an e5 first to get some more space, open up the bishop. Also very possible. So instead of taking bishop, comes here to g4 and really pins the knight and tries to immobilize one of white's most powerful pieces. This knight supports pawn pushes like e5, supports the center pawn on d4. This is an incredibly powerful piece, and this bishop was doing nothing, so black would be happy in some cases to trade off the bishop for the knight. Queen takes e5, now knight takes e4. You can already see some very tactical positions arising, and here knight to g5 was played, and the knight gets situated on a perfect square to attack black's king in the future. Now, alternatively, d5 is a move that seems incredibly powerful here, using the pin, but this is not as powerful as it seems, because black has a very nice idea here. They can take the knight, now wrecking the pawn structure, and this becomes incredibly useful because now rook to h4, and, well, this pawn on h2 is hard to defend. Of course, if you take, you allow checkmate. So the point is black gets incredible play because of the weakened white king, and therefore d5 would not have been so good, and instead moving the knight stops the king from having any sort of weaknesses, and instead aims to put weaknesses on black's king. Now rook to e7, and the point of moving the rook here is to allow perhaps the other rook to come into the game on the e file, and black wants total domination on this open file. Queen to c2, of course, threatening to infiltrate via h7, and now g6 to stop that plan. Now here the knight retreats back to e4, and this is an incredibly instructive retreating move because on the light squares, although white could try to push in some scenarios and attack on the light squares indeed, it becomes much harder, especially with this bishop here. That does not seem so promising. And so instead, white tries to switch their idea of attacking onto the dark squares, and the dark squares just got a lot more weak with this latest move. And so knight to e4 aims to centralize the knight, but specifically target this weakened square on f6, and you can imagine some great tactical combinations regarding the square. Now, of course, currently the bishop is hanging because of this fork threat, and so because of that, the bishop retreated and also put itself on a square where it's pinning the queen. Now knight to f6 was played, check. And after the king moves up, white has basically allowed the king to get to a situation where it's going to be able to take the knight if it wants to, because the queen is attacked and now the knight is attacked. But white is basically saying this: if you're going to take my knight, then your king's going to go wide into the open, and, well, do you really want that? And so the queen simply slid over to d2, looking to infiltrate on these weakened squares, and now black took the knight. And I think this is a very strong choice, because although the king, of course, is much weaker in the center of the board, otherwise this queen's going to infiltrate anyways. There's going to be massive attacking ideas. This is basically going to be game over if you don't at least get some compensation for the attack, and the compensation here is simply winning a knight. And you really put now the burden on white to prove if they have any sustainable attack that will actually lead to something. d5, again, opening up the position. Also, this diagonal is a way to attack, because realistically, going for something like queen to g5 check here, it would allow the king to escape back and cover. And so rather than immediately striking, this move d5 harms black setup, right? This knight is attacked, also the fork is threatened, but also opens up this diagonal, which would stop the retreating square on g7. So a very instructive attacking move. Rook to d8, the move that solves all the problems. You cannot take because of the pin. Also, this becomes much less possible because black can simply take. And finally, if the queen were to want to infiltrate, as it could in other lines, well, now maybe there's some problems with this pawn actually just being weak. And so for that reason, bishop to b2 check was played, the knight blocked on e5, and now f4, using the pin. And, well, white is going to win back some material here after check, and rook takes, now f takes on e5. But black seems to be totally safe here, because although the king is in the center, look at all these pieces surrounding the king. It doesn't seem like white can continue an attack. But white did indeed find one of the only moves that keeps a pretty nice advantage here, because it allows white to get access to the king, and that move is queen to g5. And you're trying to infiltrate on these weakened squares. Again, the dark squares. The second g6 was played, all of these dark squares became an immediate weakness that white tried to take advantage of. Now here, king to d7 was played, running away. You might be wondering, what is the actual threat? Let's say black wastes a move. What is the actual threat? Well, first of all, queen to f6 is possible, followed by rook to c1, and white infiltrates like this. But even more powerful is actually a4 here, white trying to now infiltrate like this. So the point is, white has files and diagonals that they're going to try to infiltrate if black does nothing. So what does black do? Run away. The king is super unsafe here. Let's just try to tug it away somewhere in the corner, maybe even on the queen side. Of course, here that tactically fails, but at some point, I mean, you can imagine the king on the b or a8 square. That could be a nice square because of the weaknesses that exist on the king side. Maybe the queen side is safer in this scenario. Rook to c1, the queen moves to b6, now bishop to c3. And in a similar manner that a4, bishop a3 would activate the bishop, bishop c3, bishop b4 aims to do the same thing. Just simply put the bishop on what seems to be the best diagonal for the current position. Rook moves to e8, bishop to b4, rook takes now on e5, and now queen to h4. a5, right? This bishop, like I've said, is simply too powerful. The rook is tied down to squares like this because of this bishop. and so black tries to get rid of the bishop. The bishop now moves to e1, and the bishop has another diagonal in mind, this g3 diagonal over to b8. You can imagine, especially with the connection of the rook on c1, there could be some major problems for black to deal with. h5, first bishop f2, disturbing the queen, and then finally bishop g3, and now rook to e4 was played, attacking the queen. Now the queen, of course, has to move, and g5 is the only safe square. So queen to g5, everyone would play this in a second. Wrong. Instead, white played rook takes f5 here. The explosive move, giving away the queen. But the point is revealed that after rook takes h4, there's rook takes d5, white wins both the bishop and the rook, and this rook is hanging, so white does get some good material for the queen, and the king is wide open in the center, and so that is also a source of compensation here. We'll explore this in a second. First, you might be wondering, is there any alternative here rather than, of course, sacrificing the rook here and going and taking the queen? Well, black can try to take with this rook, and this is setting up a little trap. You cannot take the rook here because of checkmate, but very simply rook to d1 check first, and after the king moves, something like king to c6, because noticing all these dark square weaknesses, now you can take with check. And same thing, if the king walked onto the e-file, you're going to be able to take with check. So as long as you act with check, you're going to be able to win the rook. If they take with the g-pawn as well, black survives here, but only that, because white has some great attacking ideas here. Rook to c7, and after king to e6, there's checkmate, so king to e8, and, you know, even though these pieces look powerful, there's not a great way to finish the game. A draw is probably how it would have ended via repetition. So after this beautiful sacrifice of the queen, this is a line that was basically forced to keep the game live. So rook d5, now king to e6, and here I wanted to actually share something that Bronstein wrote in his book, because of course he's the author and also the player in this specific game. He played in this game rook c to d1, but he wrote that rook to e5 check was his first intention. When he sacrificed the queen, this was the line that he saw, and after king to f6, rook to f1 check is the line that he was going to play. Now, of course, there's something clearly wrong with this. Queen takes f1 checkmate. But it goes to show that even the best players make these mistakes, and so I thought it was quite interesting and cool to share this fact with you that he wrote in his book. But okay, of course, instead of this, he saw this when the position arose, so he played rook c to d1. Now the queen moves, and after check, check, and taking the exchange here, we're left in a very interesting position. I mean, after rook to f1 check and king to g5, a draw was agreed because that is the theoretical situation. I mean, white's going to be able to pick up this pawn here on a5, and from here, I mean, it's really up to preference if you prefer a queen or two rooks that will be able to communicate. I think white has an easier game here because of these clear weaknesses that the rooks will be able to simply pile onto, and also this strong pawn here that could become a passed pawn if white takes this b7 pawn. But of course, I mean, black has a queen, so black has great chances to defend, but more importantly, maybe to counterattack this king that always has to worry about back rank checkmate ideas. So it's a very dynamic position, sure, but theoretically it's a draw, and both players agreed to that result. So this was indeed quite interesting. Now I want to move on to the second game and the final game that we're going to look at, and we're not even really going to focus on the opening or middle game. Even though there were some interesting ideas, it wasn't something that I thought was revolutionary. So I think the more important thing from this game to take away actually is this position that arises after king to d3, bishop takes a5 right here. Now white played h3 in this position, which makes, I mean, a lot of sense. A couple of plans may be related to this. g3 in some cases in a maybe king versus king endgame makes a lot of sense to stop this king from infiltrating, kind of building a wall. Or g4 in other cases where now your pawn majority on the king side maybe can start rolling down. But after bishop takes a5, instead of h3, there was a move that guaranteed a draw in a much more simple way. And I thought this was incredibly instructive because it kind of breaks the principles that were all told when we just start playing chess, which is, this pawn here, it has a lot more venom than these pawns here, because black has a lot more pawns that are kind of in the way of this pawn majority on the king side, whereas this pawn is totally totally free to promote whenever it wants, and it will be harder for white to hold that pawn than it is for black to hold all of these ones. However, trading here in this position, instead of h3, bishop to d2, trading is actually the right approach, even though it doesn't seem that smart, again, because of the fact that an outside pawn is much stronger than these ones right here, because this one always threatens to promote. The king doesn't have the luxury to come over here and try to do something on the king side, because this one threatens to promote, while this one, if it wanted to, it could travel to a1, because it's gonna be much harder for white to make his pawns start moving. But in this case, it actually does work. And it works in this very specific line where you go h3, g3, like I mentioned, building this sort of wall, stopping the king from entering. Now the king is going to try to make play on the king side anyways with g5, and it might seem like while you're going and taking this pawn, black can make considerable headway on the king side, but that actually is not the case. And in fact, if black's not careful, if they play king g4, you might even be winning in this position. They have to go for this very explosive move, c5, and make a passed pawn, and even here they just about manage to promote in time to save. So I just thought that was quite interesting and instructive, because you wouldn't really trade off the bishops in a position where you have this pawn that is weak, but a pawn that's an outside pawn that always threatens to promote, that really takes all the attention from this king. Typically, you would not want to trade it, but in this case, by calculating brute force lines, you end up seeing that this works. Okay, hopefully you guys enjoyed this round. I thought this was filled with some instructive moments, especially that aggressive game that we just looked at. Subscribe if you're new around here, like this video if you enjoyed it, and check out the other rounds in the description, and I will see you next time. Peace out.